We celebrate today the feast of Christ, the universal King. In the year 1925, Pope Pius XI introduced this feast through the encyclical Quas Primas, which means in English, in the first. And there were two reasons for the introduction of this feast to conclude the church's liturgical year. And the two reasons were, first, that the world was in turmoil. The world was giving into despair. There seemed to be no hope. People were regarding the future as a future without hope. And so Pope Pius XI came out with this encyclical for this first reason. But the second and also equally important reason is that through this feast, the church wanted to communicate to everyone the kind of king that Christ would be. And that is why the reading chosen for the feast of Christ the King is not a reading of triumphalism. It's not a reading where Christ dominates. As a matter of fact, he never dominates anywhere in the gospel. It is not a reading where Jesus feeds 5,000 and shows his authority, or feeds 4,000 and is shown as powerful. It is not a reading where he raises people from the dead, or exorcises demons, or heals lepers, or the blind and the lame and the paralyzed. It is a reading when he is hanging on the cross. And even as he hangs on the cross, abandoned by his disciples, abandoned by his followers, abandoned by the people to whom he reached out, there are people who pass by that way, who mock him. There are the religious leaders who have been responsible for his crucifixion, who berate him and make fun of him. And they challenge this man hanging on the cross to come down from the cross. He has to show his power. He has to show that he is extraordinary. He has to show that he is Son of God. And the only way he can do that, according to those who taunt him, is by saving himself. And Jesus is aware. Jesus knows that that would be the easy way out. That people would be taken up with his coming down from the cross, but only for a brief moment. Only for a little while, until they would need the next miracle and the next stupendous act and the next extraordinary event. Their faith would not be in him. Their faith would be in the event, in the miracle that he could perform. And whenever Jesus performed a miracle, it was never for himself. It was always for the other. And that is why even now, when it would have been logical and reasonable for him to save himself because he could, he does not choose that option. He chooses instead to continue to hang on the cross until finally he could commend his spirit into the Father's hands and leave this world to go to the Father. And there are 3 points which we can take from the response of Jesus and from the feast of Christ the King for us today. And the first is the lesson, is the example which Jesus has given us through his life, through his mission, and even through his death, That is, a life lived for the self is a useless life. A selfish life is not a life that anyone who believes in Jesus is called to live. It is true that we must take care of ourselves. It is true that we must be concerned about ourselves, but it is also true that we must be as concerned about others as we are about ourselves. The golden rule which Jesus not only proclaimed with his lips, but lived with his life, says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And put in another way, love your neighbor as you love yourself. This is the example that Jesus gave not only in his proclamation, not only in his teaching, not only in his preaching, but even in his life. Even as he lived, even as he died, he continued to live and die for others. Instead of saving himself, he preferred a death on the cross so that he could be raised by his Father, and so that all who believe in him could be saved. The second point that we can take with us about this feast is once again the attitude of Jesus to doing God's will. Doing God's will means that I do what I have to do at the moment, and I ensure that when I do it, my conscience is clear. My heart is clean. So I will never perform an unjust act. I will never perform an act which berates others. I will never do an action which demeans someone else. In the case of Jesus, it was always actions which enhanced, which built up, which made people whole. It is easy to find God's will and to do God's will when things are going according to the way I plan. However, there are times when my plans go awry. There are times when life gets difficult, as it did when the Pope came out with this encyclical Quas Primas. Life was difficult, and so the encyclical and the feast is offering us hope. And the hope is in the example of the crucified Christ, in the example of Jesus on the cross, who says that he is not going to work a miracle for himself. He's going to go through this ordeal, which seems like an ordeal at this moment, only because it is God's will. And one thing is clear, that God's will for us is always better for us than our own will for ourselves. If Jesus had done his own will and come down from the cross, he would have saved himself. He would have lived for a few more years. He would have died a natural death maybe. But then, he would only be a prophet. He would only be a holy man. He would only be a man who healed others and taught with authority. However, because he dared to do God's will even in the most difficult circumstances. However, even when he was taunted from the cross and may have been tempted to do his own will, he continued to do God's will. He died, but he was raised and lives again and has given all of us this new hope. Because he obeyed God's will, Jesus is not merely a prophet. He's not merely a holy man. He's not merely a miracle worker and an extraordinary teacher. Jesus is the risen Christ. And this risen Christ has prepared a place for each one of us, those who dare to follow his way of life, those who follow him, those who do God's will. And the third lesson is that there are times in our lives when we are faced with options. And sometimes the easy way out is the wrong way. But because it is the easy way, we have often taken that way. The right way is sometimes the more difficult way. And so, the challenge, like in the case of Jesus, the easy way out could have been to come down from the cross. But he knew that the harder way at that moment, but the right way, was to remain and continue to let God do what God had to do. And so on the feast of Christ the King, let us look at this crucified Jesus. But let us not keep our gaze only on the crucified Jesus, because we know that the crucified Jesus is also the risen Jesus. And in his death and resurrection gives us hope. He invites us first to live for others. Second, to continue to do God's will no matter how challenging it might be. And third, to choose the right way, even though many times it might be the more difficult way. I wish all of you a very happy feast of Christ, the universal King. Amen.